Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
One of the many changes I've had to make in my worldview since leaving traditional Christianity and trying to find a theology that works for me in my present context was leaving behind a very dismally pessimistic view of the arc of human history. For at least 3 decades, I held the view that humans were created perfect and lived a perfect, blissful existence for some short period of time. But then we made a big mistake, a decision that broke the spell of bliss and perfection, and introduced pain and suffering, anarchy, social division, and even death itself. Our history continued for the next several thousand years, during which little or nothing of which we did or aspired to do was good. Things only ever got worse. As Isaiah puts it, the best we could do was like filthy rags. And that downward trajectory was only going to continue, well, for just a little while longer. We like to say it could all end any day now, but inside we recognize, okay, it might take another 50 years, maybe a few hundred years at tops, at which point God was going to blow the whistle, call an end to the game, and then a couple post-game shows would play out in various ways, depending on your particular strand of Christian theology. On the one hand, there was going to be a short period of utter chaos, including a world-dominating empire hell-bent to kill all Christians, an apocalyptic Armageddon in the Middle East, all kinds of plagues and curses being hurled onto earth, carnage and destruction, burning and death, and then a final annihilation of the earth and even the cosmos. Most of that imagery comes from our fixation on the book of Revelation. And on the other hand, there was going to be a judgment scenario, including an eternally burning lake of fire, weeping and gnashing of teeth, sheep and goats, eternal separation of kids from parents and wives from husbands. Put everything I just said together into one long story, that's one pretty horrible downward trajectory for human history. Fortunately, both scenarios eventually resolve into some kind of return to an eternal bliss for a righteous few. Scott.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you've articulated there, I think, is the the common kind of narrative that people have adopted in the evangelical world, especially under the influence of, series like Left Behind and things like that. That whole worldview. It's not just about, of course, it is about the apocalypse, but I think you're right in saying that it's bigger than that. Like it's the whole trajectory, it's the whole attitude,
Yes.
that's what you're getting at, and so I think that, it's worth exploring those assumptions and whether that's off base and what is a better way of looking at it,
Right.
So,
well, that was the first half of my life journey through and out of Christian fundamentalism. Over the next 30 years of pondering these ideas, these images, I've completely revised my theology about what Jesus meant by the last days and about hell and the afterlife, and about the human condition, our origin and the path we've been on, and what's at the heart of our species. That revision was motivated by the confusion and cognitive dissonance and revulsion I felt toward that pessimistic view of human history, as well as by the simple fact that parts of that story are completely contradicted by scientific evidence about our evolutionary journey over the past many millions of years. A series of transformations through various ancient hominid ancestors, including a few species that we commingled with, we interbred with, and who exhibited several signs of having the same cognitive characteristics that we find in ourselves, characteristics that eventually blossomed into a superstitious religious streak. Maybe they too were on a journey of trying to find the great being in the sky. I think that's a possibility that a lot of Christians have not contemplated. In addition to not contemplating that trajectory from our ancient past, I think a lot of Christians haven't contemplated how that trajectory plays out over the next billion years of biological evolution. If history continues that long, other species will continue that journey to find the great being and could develop their own theology. During those future millions of years, we humans could go extinct, possibly at our own hands. Suicide by technology. And even if we do survive our technology, our descendants would eventually evolve into entirely new and different species, as different from us as chimps and humans have become different from each other and from our hominid ancestor over the course of a mere 7 million years. So during all those millions and billions of years, we could see a wide variety of species developing theologies that rival the complexity of our own today, even if that theology might completely contradict ours. Just look at the changes in Judeo-Christian theology itself over the past only 4,000 years, let alone theologies around the globe over the past 10,000. But before we get into the actual topic for today's discussion, I want to take a step back and put the spotlight not just on Christians, but religious and atheists alike, and ask if maybe all of us are just a little too hard on Homo sapiens. I want to talk about one very small part of that long arc of human history, the arc that stretches out millions of years in the past and millions more in the future. I want to focus on the part of that arc that represents our present day, the mere 5,000 years of recorded history and the next few thousand more yet to come. A majority of people today, religious or not, hold a very pessimistic view of the human condition, of our morality and our ethics. They focus on the headlines of the news, the wars and technological disasters, the toxic political shenanigans and the absolutely immoral horrors and so much more, and they fail to find any reason that humans are becoming better. Although they can see that humans have made progress climbing up the evolutionary ladder in the biological and cognitive senses, they cannot agree that we're also climbing that ladder in the moral and ethical senses. Today I want to explain why I do think that the arc of our morality has been bending upward, and what has been the catalytic force behind that progress.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, of course, that we're living in, I guess as all times are, where we kind of have, on the one hand, there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. We've accomplished incredible things. On the other hand, we're being warned every day almost about, some of the dangers of our technology, and the fact that artificial intelligence might be the end of humanity. And so it's a real mixed message, so it's a good topic to explore. And to get a perspective on, I was just reading actually that murder rates in the U.S. have dramatically fallen in the last couple of years, dramatically. And they're trying to figure out why. They've got different theories. But, that's the kind of thing you don't hear about too often, right? Because politicians want to keep us scared, and feeling that they're, well, I think they do. They want to keep, they want to keep us frightened and feeling like only by following their path is the path to safety. So it's in their interest. And of course, it's in the interest of the news media to keep us terrified because that's the news we watch, right? So we don't want to, hear about the million things that went right. It's just the thing that went wrong. So
That's right.
Yeah, I think we need a corrective to that. And so a good discussion on that is certainly apropos.
We've made this point before that the arc of human morality has been bending upward in an episode we released a year ago, episode 162, where we talked to Dr. and Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, the two of us as Christians and our guest as a Jew. But I didn't know at that time about a book that had been written 10 years before us by a staunchly vocal atheist, Dr. Michael Shermer, who made the same claim as we did. Not surprisingly, he identified a different catalytic force behind that progress. As they say, the devil is in the details. His book is titled The Moral Arc: How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. We thought it would be great to compare notes with Dr. Shermer and see how and where we could find common ground. A greater truth that could be found by integrating the three perspectives, Jewish, Christian, and atheist. Or at least we'll have some productive dialogue trying. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. I followed Dr. Shermer's work for a number of years and his magazine Skeptic, and I found him to be a refreshing, rational voice in the midst of a lot of the irrational that goes on in our world. And of course, he does attack religion, but in a lot of ways, fairly so, because there is often a very irrational side to religion of any kind. But of course, in the U.S. context, it's the evangelical religion that has the most influence. So obviously
Right.
he interacts with that, but he also takes to task, UFO conspirators and those kind of things. And so I think he's a voice for reason.
Right. Good. So let me first give Dr. Shermer a proper introduction. Michael achieved a master's degree in experimental psychology at California State University and then a PhD in the history of science at Claremont Graduate University. He's written dozens of books on a wide range of topics. The neurobiological basis of belief, for example, of good and evil, conspiracy theories, consciousness, skepticism, making investments, evolution, the search for God. And at the end of the episode today, we'll talk about his latest book, On Truth, with a capital T. He's the founder and current publisher and editor-in-chief of Skeptic Magazine, which is published internationally by the Skeptic Society. It's a nonprofit organization devoted to promoting scientific skepticism and resisting the spread of pseudoscience, superstition, and irrational beliefs. Dr. Shermer, Michael, welcome to our podcast.
Nice to see you, boys.
Yeah, welcome.
You just came back from Freedom Fest. That sounds like quite a party.
Oh, it was epic. Yep. No, we had a lot of fun. It's 3 days. It's always in the heat somewhere. So this year it was in Palm Springs. Where it was 105. Usually it's in Vegas where it's just as warm, but at least they have casinos. And yeah, so I don't know. It's crazy time. Yeah.
And you were giving a couple talks. You were doing a couple book signings.
Yeah. So I've been talking. Well, my one talk was on UFOs and UAPs and the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligences somewhere in the cosmos. Mostly about the former, though, because we don't know if there's ETIs out there somewhere. Probably, but we have no evidence of it yet. So keep searching. But the UFO people, they believe that they already know the answer to the question. They're here. This is sometimes called Fermi's paradox. Enrico Fermi famously asked, "Where is everybody?" They should be here by now because of this, that, and the other clever arguments, but they're not. But the UFO people say the paradox is solved. The aliens are here. Okay. So for people like me that say, "Well, where are they? Show me." And they say, "Well, we can't show you. It's classified," or they're locked up in Area 51, or, I have a friend who knows somebody whose wife's husband says he actually saw the spaceships. Okay. Who was that? Well, I can't tell you his name because it's classified. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So what did you make of the congressional hearings then? And like my brother, for example, is an engineer, a very rational guy, and he's certainly not one to believe in, but he actually contacted me. He said, I'm starting to kind of wonder a bit, because of these congressional hearings and things like that. So what'd you make of all that?
Yes. Well, of course, I mean, Congress, they have hearings all the time. Most of them are not that big. This one wasn't particularly large. The several ones that they've had in the last 2 years. But still, okay, what are they doing? Well, a legitimate argument would be there could be things in our skies, our airspace, particularly above our military bases that, don't belong there. Could they be Chinese or Russian drones or whatever? Nobody in the government thinks they're aliens. That they've made that clear. They're just saying we don't know what it is. We should find out what it is, just in case we're being spied on. And that's not irrational. We know governments spy on each other. We spy on the Chinese and the Russians and so on.
Yep.
The CIA is notorious for the things that they've done over the decades, since the Second World War. So yeah, that's fine. But then if you drill down to like the subjects, the particular people testifying, like Grush, for example, it comes off as very credible. But in fact, is there any way to check what he's saying? And the answer is no. He says, well, I can't tell you every question. Well, where are these spaceships? Can't tell you. Well, who is it that saw it? Can't tell you. You end up with this just super frustrating. Yeah. Like, okay, well, where's there to go from here? I'll tell you at another hearing that's closed. So I'm not divulging any secrets that I shouldn't be, because I don't want to get into trouble. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, when's this closed hearing going to be? And can you give it information to somebody we tried? I don't know, Marco Rubio or somebody like that, who could say, I can't tell you exactly what I saw, but yeah, it was definitely off-world or something like that. Okay, but no, nothing. And I've been in this space since we started the magazine in 1992, but really since I was in college in the 70s, following Carl Sagan. This is all super interesting stuff, but since that time, we still have no evidence at all, none. And, all these UAP sightings, the videos and photos are always grainy and blurry, and you can't quite make out what's going on. It's like, yeah, but, there's a billion of these, here's my phone, a billion of these things with high resolution cameras that shoot video. And if not one, we can't get one in focus. Yeah. And then the joke is that actually the UFOs are out of focus. I mean, it's like a stealth technology or a cloaking device. It's like a Star Trek cloaking device.
Right.
In this day and age, with AI, with the graphics image generators that we now have, why has nobody ever created a video that isn't grainy, that looks convincing?
Well, there have been some in the past, but they're obviously fake. And but I am concerned about that because the technology is unbelievably good now. And of
Yeah,
course, there's more serious issues of, fake sex videos of famous people and things like
sure,
that
sure.
that you really won't be able to tell the difference. And
Right.
yeah, that's a problem. Well, so we're developing laws about that, and that's probably a good thing.
I had this thought, and I don't know if you've had it or you've heard it from others about the Fermi paradox, that here's a possible solution. Maybe there's a kind of almost a law in the universe that civilizations advance to a certain point and then go and extinct themselves. In other words,
Yeah, yeah,
kind of the
that's right.
path we're on right now. And so
Yeah, yeah.
the Fermi paradox is they never get here because they get to the point and then they're gone, you know? Have
Yeah,
you heard
that's
that?
oh yeah, yeah. There's a book about the Fermi paradox, and it's like 50 solutions to the Fermi paradox. So that's one of them, that civilizations blow themselves up or do something that causes their extinction. More likely along those lines would be that if there were ETIs out there, these extraterrestrial civilizations, the chances of them existing now are pretty slim. The universe is 14 billion years old. Our solar system is 4.5 billion years old. Our civilization is just, a few thousand years old. The chances of them being lined up with us in time are very slim. If they're ahead of it, I mean, if they're in our future, we're not going to find out. If they've been in our past, it would be like millions of years ago they came here. And that evidence would be gone. It would just disappear. I mean, even there's calculations on this, like the Great Pyramid or any of the pyramids in Egypt, they won't last a million years. They'll be gone. They'll be eroded down to sand, and there'll be no trace evidence of them at all in a million years. So if were here and they left some technology or whatever, it's very likely just gone.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Okay, gentlemen, my job is to keep us
Yep.
on an outline here. Michael, we wanted to talk with you about your book, The Moral Arc. It's been around for a few years, but it resonated with an episode we did a year ago, and we had very much the same message, but we wanted to compare notes with you. Some have referred to this as your magnum opus, which would be another reason why we'd want to talk to you about that one. Maybe if you could just give us your thumbnail sketch of that book.
Sure, yeah. So the moral arc is about moral progress over the past several centuries since the scientific revolution, the age of reason, and the Enlightenment, and how we shifted from religion and politics being the ultimate determiner of, how governments and society should be structured to generate the greatest human flourishing. That, in fact, that was never actually the goal. To this idea that moral problems are actually soluble problems. Health and disease and, slavery and torture and civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and so on. These are all ideas that, kind of evolved over a long historical period, mainly based on rational arguments pushing back against religious arguments, which always wanted to restrict, who the moral sphere of who constitutes an honorary member of our tribe, who should be treated equally under the law, treated with respect and dignity and so on. That's what has changed, and it has changed remarkably over the centuries. Now, if you take just the headlines, it looks bad. We got the Gaza and Israel, now Israel and Iran, or you have Russia and Ukraine. If you follow the headlines, it would be easy to conclude that things are bad and getting worse. Maybe they're the worst they've ever been. In fact, the opposite is true, but you have to follow the trend lines and see that these kinds of conflicts we're experiencing are really exceptions to the rule, which is that countries don't change borders, countries don't fight, and so on. Obviously, it's not 100%. They do, but not like before. If you look back centuries ago, there was, war was just a constant background noise to civilization. It was always going on. Borders were always changing. This is why what Putin wants to do in his revanchist exploits in Ukraine is so unusual. I mean, people are outraged. How could but autocrats and dictators, they used to redraw the maps all the time and color in the shade of their country over the other one. And that was common. Now it's not so common. Not that it can't happen or doesn't happen. It's just that it's less likely to happen. So I'm just saying that, it's moral progress is, 3 steps forward, 2 back, and so on. But in the long run, like compound interest, it just builds and builds and builds, and societies just get better and better, even though there's constant, tugs and pushes and pulls and debate about, these things. Abortion is legal, it's illegal, then it's legal, then it's illegal. Yeah, but overall, women's rights, have been largely positive.
And so I was going to ask, given that this is the 10th year anniversary of your book, and as you just said, a lot of things have changed. You mentioned many examples I was going to mention. Also, the polarization of society. I mean, today's society around the world is just so polarized. So if you were to do a revised version, an anniversary version, would you add anything into the book or would you change anything in the book?
Oh, I would for sure, along the lines of what you just mentioned. It's not religion and race so much that's divisive now, but political orientation, political parties, and so on. And there's a lot of data to support this, that it's not just the availability heuristic or the recency effect, where I just happen to notice it now because I'm paying attention, where in fact it was always bad. No, in fact, even going back to like the tumultuous years of Vietnam and Watergate and all that, the polarization between the parties, between people in the parties, congressmen, senators, and just general voters. Data like, how would you feel if your son or daughter married somebody in the other party? That used to be not a big deal. It's a big deal now. People say, well, I would disown or I would forbid it or something. Or would you work with somebody, or would you recreate with somebody who's in the other political party? Now, it's majorities say no in both parties. They don't like the other ones, and it used to be that people in the other party were wrong. Now they're not just wrong; they're evil. So this is the left accuses the right of being evil. There's some of that on the right about the left, but it's more along that the left, people on the left are morons or idiots or stupid or useful idiots or whatever. But the point is, why would you want to hang out or marry a useful idiot, a moron, or an evil Hitler, orange Hitler supporter, that kind of thing. So that's definitely worse. Also, I would probably add a chapter on trans rights, because that has been sort of the sequel to gay rights. Recall as late as 2011, both Obama and Hillary were, at least publicly, against same-sex marriage. And then after 2015, when SCOTUS made it the law of the land, then everybody changed their mind. And it largely became a topic that everyone quit talking about, including most conservatives. So I'm fond of saying conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. That's the changing moral zeitgeist. It just happens slowly enough over the decades, a decadal level, that you don't quite notice it until you look back, or you have data or charts or graphs, or people like me or Steven Pinker pointing it out.
Right.
What do you think is behind that polarization? And my question is not American polarization, but this is around the world, like anti-immigrant polarization, that's around the world. Right-wing, left-wing politics, that's all around the world. There's so many things. It seems like the world today is so polarized. What do you think's behind all of that?
There's different theories about this. Political scientists study this. Sociologists study it. It's probably multifactorial, maybe even overdetermined, more causes than there actually are. Certainly media fuels it. It's starting with conservative talk radio, and then Fox News, and then MSNBC, and then CNN, kind of abandoning their goal or mission of objective journalism to being more left-wing. That's part of it. So people they just watch one channel, or they just, are in a bubble. Social media accelerates it for sure, because the financial model that fuels social media sites is, number of eyeballs and clicks that you get. And we know from studies of like what kind of words or phrases or sentences in a tweet, say, are more likely to generate retweets. And this has been studied. They have these AI programs that analyze language, and you could see these are the words here, not just the kind of emotional words, but these specific words. If you plug them into your sentence, you'll get more hits and more retweets. And the acceleration of the polarization on social media is largely driven by the financial model, or just the way it's structured to get more attention. There's so much competition online for attention that the more outraged, emotional, agitated, polarizing you are, if I post something like, well, I think the Democrats are wrong about immigration, as opposed to, the Democrats are evil, they hate America, they want to destroy our country by bringing in all these foreigners, that will get way more attention, right? And so just look at just some podcasts, since I do podcasts, you do podcasts, that Joe Rogan has on Douglas Murray, who's a longtime friend. who's a war correspondent for The Spectator, for the Free Press, and other sites. And he's over there in Israel, and he's tracking and following the conflict with Gaza. That's what war correspondents do. So what does Rogan do? He has him on the show because Douglas has a new book out, and he has Comic Dave Smith on as a counter. Who's Comic Dave Smith? I'd never heard of him. Well, here he is. He has a popular podcast in which he riffs about these kinds of topics. Conflict. He's a libertarian, so he's against the Israeli-Gazan conflict for these reasons, apparently. And so why is that? Why doesn't Joe have on just Douglas, or Joe have on an expert, a historian who's written books about the Middle East? Because that won't generate the kind of attention this particular episode got. I mean, it was seen by just tens and tens of millions of people because Douglas really pushed back and they got into a huge thing. And, anyway, so or Tucker Carlson, what's he doing over there in Russia, visiting a supermarket with his little basket going, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, he can't be that dumb.
No,
right?
He can't be that dumb.
So this has to be like, I'm going to get so much shit for this. This is going to be epic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, I'm, as most people nowadays, I'm a watcher of many YouTube people and stuff. And it's very interesting to me. You talk about a moral arc. In the case of the moral arc of YouTubers, it's not bending towards. In other words, there's a few of them that I have hooked onto, and they're good. But then you see them slowly devolve. And the reason they devolve is because being objective and good and rational and all that doesn't pay the bills. So they just and eventually they become nuts. Like I'm trying to think of an example but Tucker Carlson might be a good example. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s when he was on CNN, he wasn't a nut bar. Like he was he was a conservative, and but he's gone completely, wacko. And I'm sure, he's making bank.
Yes, absolutely.
Doing it, and it's
absolutely.
So it kind of, and maybe I wouldn't be any better if I had to, I don't know, but the technology leads people in that direction, and that's a fundamental problem.
I can comment on a few other threads. I think it's a different generation now. I mean, we look at generational changes, baby boomers and millennials, Gen X, millennials, and now iGen, Gen Z. They are different in temperament and sensitivities to slights. They're more victim-oriented, victimization-oriented. Coddled is the word sometimes used. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, track this back to the helicopter parenting of the 90s, where you want to be super, super protective of your offspring because you only have one or two rather than 8 or 9. And so those kids then grow up and they're adults now. They went to college. And when they went to college, say 2014, 15 through 2020, 21 or so, in that window, that's when you start to see this huge spike in hypersensitivity about the slightest things like Halloween costumes. This is the famous Yale University one where Nicholas Christakis defended his wife's email to the students who were getting agitated about Halloween costumes. What should be allowed and what should not be allowed? And she basically said, you're adults. You decide what costumes you want to wear. We're not here to tell you how to wear costumes. And then they were outraged by this, right? And that's just one of hundreds of examples that have been documented. Or the number of cancellations of speakers, disinvitations, is tracked by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education Expression. And they've tracked it over the last 25 years or so, and it definitely a huge spike after 2015. So there's something about the generation that's different as well.
Yeah. And I think a big factor is the anonymity that social media gives us these days. When you look at these bizarre conversations, the crazy ideas, those conversations, the participants are always, their names are ones that you can't recognize, Laser Blaster 89, whatever. I think it's the anonymity that allows people to say things that they haven't really thought through.
Well, you're right, Luke. But even beyond the anonymity, we're listening in on people's what should be private thoughts, like you said, not well thought out. But it's people like but it's your president that does this. It's Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet, that does this now. Just throw stuff out there, and I think that's another factor that's huge in all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, the moral arc, gentlemen.
Yeah, back to the
Michael,
moral
I
arc.
wanted to say right up front, we agree with you 100%. We did an episode, as I said, a year ago on the arc of human morality increasing. And you literally wrote the book on this, and so we wanted to compare notes. We have the same conclusions, but I think we might be coming at it from different directions. We might have different explanations, and so it's great to compare notes and see if we can synergize.
Cool.
So a lot of the people are convinced to their core that the 20th century was the most violent one ever, and they would say that the 21st is only shaping up to be worse. We've already talked a bit about that. One of the things you did in your book was to look back over the past few centuries and show how violence has actually been decreasing, and when you look at the numbers on a per capita basis. But so a lot of people just aren't satisfied with per capita numbers. They just see the raw numbers going up. They also say those numbers are misleading because violent crime is being replaced with non-violent crime in today's society. Mugging and armed robberies are too risky. You can steal just as much money, if not more, using non-violent means, identity theft, computer crimes, racketeering, blue-collar versus white-collar crimes. So are the changes in deaths and violence the best way to gauge human morality?
Well, I think you can come at it from different perspectives, which is good. First of all, the 20th century was 100 years long, not 50 years. You know, the first half was way different than the second half, right? I mean, you have the huge two spikes, World War I, World War II, and then the genocides associated with the Second World War by Japan and Germany. But that all ended in 1945. Well, what's happened since then? There's been proxy wars during the Cold War. So two things, the decolonization movement, those colonies, those one-time colonies that then gained their independence, saw a spike in internal violence, sometimes civil wars, sometimes just conflict between the different groups competing for power. So you're going to see a spike there. But once most of them settle in and create a government, and then it becomes more stabilized. And then the other factor, then of course the Cold War. So a lot of the proxy war, Korean War, Vietnam War in our case, you know, these are proxy wars, and there's lots of those, but they're much smaller, and the death tolls are much smaller than major interstate conflicts, or even previous kinds of civil wars, like the American Civil War, 600, 700,000 dead. You know, these tend to be much smaller than that. Even genocides, you know, probably the worst one was the Hutu and Tutsis in Rwanda, 1996. So even the genocides since then are much smaller than they were in the past, which tended to, you know, rack up body counts in the millions. Then another couple of factors, you know, the worst century in history has to happen in some century. Well, one reason it happens in the 20th century is because several factors. Populations are much higher. So the number of people that are killed, available to die, is much more. Weapons are much more effective, weapons of mass destruction. You know, centuries ago, they simply could not kill that many people. Although clearly you don't need bullets and bombs. I mean, you could do it with machetes like they did in Rwanda, but still that's less likely to happen. You know, but then we have international institutions that develop, like the EU and the UN and so on. Even though they're not super effective at preventing violence, they're better than nothing, and they do work for the most part. On average, conflicts are less than now. For the 21st century, again, you can pick out isolated cases like the body counts with the Syrian civil war, but that's over now. And it looks like, well, too soon to tell here on Iran, but it's possible that their regime could come to an end, and that would, you know, lift up the half their population to having equal civil rights, namely the women. And so that would be another step. But even so, you know, you look at the hotspots, you know, North Korea, Iran, Putin, Russia, Xi's China, you know, but you know, centuries ago, pretty much all countries were like that. I mean, most countries were run by dictators of some sort, theocrats or autocrats. You know, democracies really didn't take hold until the 1920s. I mean, even the United States was not really a democracy until 1920, when women got the right to vote. You know, or if you want to make it 1865, when slavery was ended, whatever. I mean, you know, it's an evolving process.
Maybe the Voting Rights Act, you know, even for blacks, you know.
Yeah, right. So we're talking 1960s before.
Right.
Yeah. So this is pretty new.
Following that line, you're talking about, you know, the first half of the 20th century. It's interesting to me that the 1945, totally agree, is that kind of breaking point. But is it a morality issue, or is it the exploding of the atomic bomb? Because it seems to me that once the atomic age starts, war is no longer a viable way to solve problems, really, like not in a major sense, right? And therefore we're forced to either have smaller skirmishes or look through diplomacy and other ways to resolve our differences. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting argument. There's actually somebody made the argument of giving the atomic bomb the
Nobel.
Nobel Peace Prize
Yeah, well, maybe.
and give that to Oppenheimer.
Right.
Well, I mean, I hate to think that, we need nuclear weapons forever to prevent, major conflict. It'd be nice to not, it would be preferable to not have them, but the genie's out of the bottle. It's going to be hard to put it back. I don't see us getting to nuclear zero anytime soon. Probably not even in this century. Who knows? But yes, it is a kind of a deterrent. So this is the mutual assured destruction argument, and it's a game theoretic logic at work, and I think it's correct. So even Putin, which if anybody would do it, it'd probably be him. He hasn't. Why hasn't he done it? Well, we know why, because he doesn't want to cease to exist along with the rest of his country, because that's what would happen.
Well, don't you think the thing that's happening in Iran right now is a perfect example of mad at work? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We can't. I mean, they've made it clear what they would do if they had nuclear weapons. They would eradicate Israel. Okay. Well, thank you for being honest and open with it. Now we know what to do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So,
Michael, another point that you make in your book is that humanity achieves this greater morality through science. And you look at the history following the Enlightenment and point out the gains that were obtained since then. You attribute most of that, if not all of that, to science and reason. But some of your critics will say that science and technology have at the same time been part of the problem. And we were just talking about the nuclear bomb, but things like global warming is very much related to the technology we've created. Biological weapons are another one. Science getting us into areas where we're not sure we're ready for this. I'm thinking of genetics and artificial intelligence. So is science really this? Has it been bringing the solutions? Has it been creating problems? Is this just a matter of perspective? Glass half full, glass half empty kind of thing?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, first of all, by science, I don't mean we're going to the ichthyologist to ask about abortion or something. I mean science as a principle system of determining what's true and accurate information and so on. Just that kind of rationality, reason, empiricism, evidence-based. That's what I mean. And that has been broadening. Solving problems in society is what science does best by figuring out cause and effect, causality determination. Now, as David Deutsch points out in his magnum opus, The Beginning of Infinity, all solutions to problems will create new problems. And then we'll create new solutions to those problems, and that'll create more problems, right? So, the printing press that produces Shakespeare's works also produces Mein Kampf. Well, that's the way it goes. That we want books, right? Or we're facing this now with AI. Oh, it's an existential threat. Maybe, but it sure is useful. Computers and software, all this stuff. It's all going to be enhanced by AI. Let's just go forward, and then when problems arise, then we can find solutions to those problems. That'll create new solutions, and on and on and on. It's like, when elevators were first created, they had the little guy sitting in there on this little stool pushing the buttons for people. I don't know why. I guess they couldn't figure it out themselves. But in any case, those elevator operators were all replaced by computers. And so what happened to them? Well, they found something else to do. And it's always going to be like that, right? So all solutions to problems create new problems, and then we find new solutions to those, and so on and so on. The joke about that is, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. So, we just found better ways to do things, and the new metal tools also created metal weapons that were deadlier than stone weapons. Yeah, but they also bring benefits. So you just keep moving forward. That's the principle.
And I guess those who have a invested interest in the old are going to be probably most resistant to the new, right? Like, in a sense.
That's partially true. And people without a memory, like, they think, that I want to go back when in the good old days, but they're just forgetting all the bad things of the good old days.
Selective memory.
Yes.
So, Michael, your starting point for measuring changes in morality is the Age of Enlightenment, and you attribute all the praise for any changes to science, and any blame goes to religion. But are you stacking the deck in your favor when you start there at the age of enlightenment? And so let me just give an example of what I'm getting at here. If you're trying to decide whether to invest your money in a certain stock or not, you can come to a completely different conclusion if you look at what it was worth 10 or 20 years ago when it had just come out of the subprime mortgage crisis. And that stock might have tripled during the recovery from that, compared to what it was 30 years ago before the market crash and quickly lost 75% of its value. So the 20-year numbers might show a 300% gain, but the 30-year numbers show you might gain 5 or 10%. And so that's why I use that analogy. If you look at history, starting from the Enlightenment, when science is just beginning to flourish and bloom and hasn't yet had any opportunity to accrue strikes against it, and at the same time, the church has had a couple thousand years to make mistakes and failures, and at that time of the Enlightenment, it's mired in sordid conflicts and politics and degeneration. So it isn't hard to make an argument that science is a winner and religion is a loser. Are you getting tailwind by choosing the Enlightenment as your starting point?
That's a great tee up. Yes, I like that. I thought you were going to describe my stock picking methods. Buy low, sell high. I just happened to buy by chance because I made some money in 2009 when the market was at the bottom.
Right.
And so it's like I was very, very proud of my achievements. And even some of my professional investor friends are like, "Oh my God, I've never seen anybody make some," because I bought all the what are now called the Mag 7, Google and Apple and Intel and Microsoft and all that stuff, and they've done spectacular. And my answer is no, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just got lucky, so yeah. Okay, but I take your point. So we could go back further, maybe a couple centuries earlier with the rise of humanism. Sort of humanism. I mean, more of biblical criticism, literary development of literary scholarship. The humanities are very different then than they are now. Let's say in the 1400s, 1300s, 1200s even, of, starting off with biblical criticism and analysis of text, and then turning that to other narratives and developing sort of a rational technique for how to analyze texts can be then extrapolated to analyzing anything. What are the rational arguments we have? And of course, before that, there was Aristotelian logic and that sort of thing, which is a form of rationality. So yeah, you could go back as far as you want. You could go back to Athens and Jerusalem, as some religious people do, that Christianity, Judeo-Christian worldview is based in Athens and Jerusalem, combination there. So you can take it back thousands of years if you want. But I start at the scientific revolution and age of enlightenment because the shift there is to specifically try to solve problems through some technique that we would now call the scientific method. So, for example, at the time that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, there was already underway movements by different European governments to try to solve the economic problems. How come those guys over there have more money than we do? So the initial model was, mercantilism. We have to get more gold. The French need more gold than the Germans because they're richer than us, whatever. This turned out to be a faulty theory, a bad explanation for the wealth of nations. So what made Smith's book important is the first part of the title. Everyone thinks it's called On the Wealth of Nations. But the actual title is a treatise on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And so it's the nature and causes part that was so different and radical. And he said, let's use data, let's use examples, and so on. And that's what made it revolutionary. It was a method of figuring out what's the best way to structure an economy, because these structures here produce that, and these models over here produce something vastly more prosperous for the people. And so that's what works. And so this became known as laissez-faire, because in France, the model was described as just leave everybody alone. And it's a bottom-up system. It'll self-organize. That was radical at the time. But that would just be one example of many. Or Cesare Beccaria's book on crime and punishment, where he made the radical idea that the punishment should fit the crime. This was brand new. Before that, it was just hang them all, let God sort it out.
Okay, but I got to stop you for a second. I agree, and I agree with you, by the way, that, like, at that time, yes, hang them high. However, and you maybe won't want to hear this, the lex talionis is actually that principle in the Old Testament. Even though we see it as such a negative thing, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the essence of that is exactly what you're saying. An eye for an eye, right? Not a head for an eye. In other words, the punishment should fit the crime. And so we're talking 2000 or well more than that, before the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, but even so, I mean, you can find almost anything you want in the Bible. Obviously, no one took that seriously in terms of criminal
that's
justice.
true. That's true.
I mean, if you look at the books, like the death penalty, capital punishment was applicable in England before the Enlightenment. It was there was like 220 different crimes for which you could be executed, including insulting the Queen's garden, pickpocketing, protesting the government. These are all punishable by death, right? And so it's been whittled down now, well, completely in most countries, but here in the United States, just murder and treason. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Do you see any, your views on religion are well known and well thought out and well articulated. But I'm curious do you see any positive role for religion in the process, or is it all negative? I just recently read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's works, and was kind of interested to find in there, he was actually a religious guy in a lot of ways. So he's not some atheist that is propounding these kind of things. A lot of these ideas do come out of a Christian subculture. Now, maybe you would say, well, yeah, Christian, but not consistent. I'm not sure, but how do you respond to that?
Yeah. I'm not dogmatically against religion. Religion is good when it does good. It's bad when it does bad. I like to look at the results. Religious people and religions do get on board with civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and so on. Eventually, they do. They're slow to move. Understandably, I mean, that's sort of what conservatives do for a living, is they resist change and make it slower so that we don't tear down the whole system. Here, I'm thinking of Burkean conservatism, supporting the American Revolution, but not the French Revolution, because the French just wanted to tear it all down and start over and just, cut off all their heads and we'll be fine. Burke said, you know what, that's maybe not such a good idea. Maybe we should keep some of the institutions that are working, and get rid of the ones or modify the ones that are not working.
Right.
I would apply it to that. Religion is good that way. And also, I should say, parenthetically, the religious people I know, are mostly just really good people trying to do the right thing, and they are helpful. We know I have data that religious people donate more and give more blood and so on. That's all true. That's all good.
Yeah.
I'm glad they're there.
I appreciate that.
Michael, I want to push back a bit on what you said a few moments ago, how religion has been slow to get on board, has been holding things back. And I actually wanted to push back on that. I asked you earlier whether the right starting point was the Enlightenment. I was going to suggest, why don't we go back a few thousand years before that? In fact, go before recorded history, and let's see what we see there. A lot of data suggests we had forms of religion and of science, even at that time, before recorded history. They built temples, and they had agriculture, they had forms of astronomy. Their science and religion were both rudimentary, and based on a lot of superstition, very little data, a lot of anecdotal evidence, really. But with more time and more data, more discussion, both religion and science became more developed. And as we move through the recorded histories of the Babylonian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, both religion and science developed considerably. Just look at how much we, in Western society today, we derive from the Greeks and the Romans, and the Jews, parenthetically. And it's at this point in history, the first millennium of the Common Era, that I think we need to stop and take notice. What have we not yet seen at this period in time in all the civilizations and world empires that preceded this point? We've not seen massive coordinated humanitarian relief efforts when people helped out another unrelated group of people who suffered a major disaster, a tsunami or a flood or whatever. We've not seen hospitals or schools or universities and libraries for everyone in society. We've not seen social welfare nets for the poor, the marginalized, and the outcast. These things started happening over the next 1,000 years after the Roman Empire has collapsed. And who is at the leading edge of those changes? Especially the hospitals and the universities that set the stage for the growth of science. It was religious people. You look at the early universities and hospitals, they were all founded by Christians. So can we not work together? Can religion, science, and humanism not work together?
I'm good with that. Let's do that. Again, but
Okay.
let's kind of drill down on it a little bit. I mean, they were the only game in town because governments weren't doing anything like that. It wasn't until
Mm.
Bismarck's kind of deep state bureaucracy of welfare system that then spread throughout Europe and into the United States, and now all Western democracies allocate roughly between 20 and 25% of GDP to transfers of wealth to people that need it. And
If I may, though, I said, look at the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. They had government, they had laws, they had all these
mm,
things, but
mm,
they didn't bring these things in. It was, well, what turned out to be the Roman Catholic Church, which I have my problems against them too. But my point was, they were the ones, Christians in that circle, that brought in all of these things.
yes, okay, they get some credit for that, I guess, and you can find some biblical passages that seem to support that. But again, most governments do not take that particularly seriously. I mean, slavery was endorsed and illegal in most countries for thousands of years. So even if you find biblical passages that you think support the abolition of slavery or the treatment of people equally and so on, like in Galatians, there are no Jews or Greeks, there's just, people and so on. Yeah, but no one paid any attention to that. I mean, it's not like that launched a revolution. And even in the abolition of slavery movement by the Quakers and Wilberforce and some of the other agitators for the abolition of slavery, their major opponents were their fellow Christians who were absolutely against ending the slave trade. You could just, as you know, in the Moral Arc, I track a lot of these preachers' sermons in the mid 1800s America, who are absolutely 100% in favor of slavery. This is the way God wants it. Here's our arguments. Here's our reasons. Here's our biblical passages. It's all good. Just leave it alone. And those are all Christians doing that. So, to whatever extent somebody who is ahead of the curve, like Wilberforce, good for them. The Quakers, yes, all the power to them. In hindsight, we look back and go, those are the ones that got it right. But of course, that's in hindsight. What would you and I, if we came back 500 years from now, what do you and I believe now that our ancestors will go? I'm sorry, our descendants will go, whoa, I can't believe they ate meat or whatever it is.
Well, animal rights might be one
Yeah,
of them.
yeah,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
like you said, the fact that we not only eat meat, but we've industrialized the destruction
Yes,
of animals, and
yeah.
But Michael,
yeah,
what you said a moment ago about how there were church leaders and a lot of Christianity who were getting in the way of emancipation, there were also prominent leaders and thinkers of the Enlightenment. They championed individual rights and equality, but at the same time, they owned slaves and profited from the slave trade.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So are we
I
picking
know, yeah,
are we
yeah.
picking the members of the teams we're rooting behind?
Well, okay. I think the question has become is really what are the ideas of these people? Jefferson, what were Jefferson's ideas that were really good and that we've adopted that have been useful for our civilization? Forget what he did personally with it. He owned slaves or he had a mistress who was black,
right.
whatever. Okay. I don't care. I care about his ideas. And, so I think
So,
that's the way to
so,
do it.
so, so, okay, I think that's right. And so, if you're looking at it from the idea perspective, is the idea behind Christianity that man is a dignified creature, that all people should be treated as bearers of God's image and so on, that's a revolutionary idea. Like I always joke, there were no handicap spaces at the Colosseum, right? The the Romans the Romans and the Greeks just didn't have that concept really, it might made right. And Christianity comes into it, and its actual symbol is weakness, right? It's death. So is that not a revolutionary idea that you think had a big impact?
Maybe. Give me the passages that in the Bible that you think support that.
Okay. Well, I can't off the top of my head, but I mean, I
Well,
think
there
I
are
could.
many. I know because Dinesh D'Souza wrote a book called "What's So Great About Christianity" without a question mark. But he argues that this comes from the Bible, but he only quotes one passage, that one in Galatians. There is no such thing as a Greek or a Jew. There's just we're all just the
Well, I
same
think
under
it's the,
God.
I don't think it's about quoting passages. I think it's the story.
Yeah,
I
okay, so
mean,
the story. How does the story? Which story? The Jesus resurrection story?
the idea that Jesus stands up to power, but he stands up to
Hmm.
power by bowing down to it, right? By
Hmm.
not answering Pilate like he maybe could have, but being willing to suffer for justice, to suffer for, that there is that whole aspect. And I'm not saying it's emphasized often, even by a lot of Christian theologians. And
Well,
as
I'm on board with you there in this sense that I don't think there really was a resurrection.
no, I know.
I think it's a mythological story that represents something important. What you just said, you know, redemption, forgiveness, starting over, being born again, and giving other people the benefit of the doubt, let them forgive them and so on. That's the truth of that story, in my
Right.
opinion.
Yeah, well, okay, so I happen to believe there is a historical reality behind the story. You don't believe that, but the story itself is a great story, and I think a revolutionary kind of story that feeds into what we're talking about, this moral arc, because why is it in the Christian West, well, I should say the Judeo-Christian West, and maybe even include Islam to some extent in that, but why is it in that Western world that all of a sudden humans come to the forefront? The liberal values of the West, I think, are deeply kind of rooted in that, no matter what you believe about it, in a sense, right?
Certainly, that's
Okay,
certainly the case. Yeah,
okay,
we do live
okay.
in a Judeo-Christian worldview. Yes.
And I think that's the good part of it. There's a lot of bad parts of it too, but
Certainly better than the alternatives,
well, yeah,
religious alternatives in the case.
And this point that you're just agreeing on here, this is the point of Tom Holland's book, Dominion. How the Western society is built on Christian principles, and as much as we try to deny that, I think I would agree with him. And the point is not I'm not trying to say Christians now hold the flag. I think we can hold the flag together with humanists and with science, and together we can advance morality.
I agree.
Right.
I'm very ecumenical that way. I follow Carl Sagan's approach to this. Being a militant atheist is not particularly useful. And if we want to solve collective action problems like climate change, nuclear weapons, and so on, we need the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims. We need
Right.
everybody.
Right. Yeah, I think this is where, in a case like Richard Dawkins, even though I have tremendous respect for his giant brain and his ability to articulate his views and so on, but I think he's done a lot of damage in the sense that he makes it appear that to be bright or to be scientific, you have to be an atheist. And that approach I just don't think that's going to fly, with a lot of people.
Well, even if, yeah, okay, that's the pragmatic thing. What's the best strategy? But it's not true that religious people are not smart. No, that's not the problem. Intelligence is largely orthogonal to issues of what people believe about politics, religion, the nature of the universe, and so on. People arrive at their beliefs for other reasons, and then they back into it, arguments and reasons for them. But the belief was already there for a different reason.
Right. And that's true of all beliefs. Now maybe you don't agree, but I think that's true of atheists too. They come to their beliefs also.
Maybe for some, it could be like ex-smokers. They want to go out and stamp out everybody else doing that. But atheism is not a position. This is a statement I make all the time. It's not anything. It's not a worldview. It's not a position. It's just saying, I don't believe in God. That's it. But what do you believe? Oh, I'll tell you what I believe. Civil rights and women's rights and gay rights, and I believe in love and dignity and equality before the law and justice and restorative justice. I just rattled it off. But that's not atheism. That's something else. It's humanism or enlightenment humanism or something.
So what is that linkage, by the way? I wanted to ask you this before, but so you're talking about science and scientific reason on the one hand, and scientific reason, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my perspective at least, Luke and I have talked about this, he's a scientist many times, is basically a method for investigating empirical reality. And it's incredibly good at that, right? Incredibly good. But what's the linkage then between the non-empirical realities that we also have to deal with? So morality can be informed by empirical reality. I certainly see that. But just like in COVID, I thought it was fascinating that there was this whole thing about we got to let the science lead, got to let the science lead. Well, true. The science has to inform. However, deciding who's going to get the vaccine, deciding how we're going to do that's not scientific, right?
Yes, I agree.
I don't think
right.
I don't think. Yeah. So how do you link those two in your?
And I would use climate change as another example. Whether the Earth is getting warmer or not, or glaciers really melting or not, whatever. That's just an empirical question. How many trillions of dollars should we spend by 2100 to lower the temperature by 2 degrees? That's a political question.
Right.
But even that should be informed by evidence. So Bjorn Lomborg has done the heavy lifting on this, doing the calculations. Like if you took the world's top 20 problems that need to be solved, I know malaria, hunger, poverty, climate change, just list them all down, nuclear weapons, whatnot. And how much should we spend for each of those? Well, when you actually put people on the job, you lock them up in a room for 2 weeks and they have to come up with their list and reasons. Turns out climate change is pretty far down the list. It's really not that big of a threat in terms of the opportunity costs of dealing with that instead of something else, right? So, I mean, to lower the Earth's average temperature by like 2 or 3 degrees by 2100 would cost something like $5 trillion between now and 2100. Well, what could we do with those trillions of dollars? We could buy mosquito nets for every single person in Africa and end malaria. Well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's a better idea. Or
Right.
potable water, or vaccines, or vitamins for poor people, and so on and so on. So so even what seems like purely political decisions or economic decisions are a kind of still a rational argument to be made using data and information and empirical evidence. Like, what do we know about this particular method of treatment for whatever it is, vaccines or for malaria, something like that? Well, we know that we can do it this much with this amount of money, and so those are rational decisions based on evidence.
Right. And I totally agree with that. They're informed by the science, but I don't think they're determined by the science.
No, not determined, but even there, I would say that why should we care about people in Africa? Why do I care about that? And if you would have asked me that 500 years ago, I would have said, I don't.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck. Go to the house next to mine. Maybe he'll give you some money. But more and more people have taken to caring about what goes on in Africa, and nonprofits have figured out how to exploit that. Not exploit, but use that those natural empathies we have for our own kin and kind, and expand the moral circle to include other people who we don't know. And so they do this by personalizing it. So, there's this well-known effect in nonprofits for fundraising that if you show people a picture of 1,000 starving kids in Rwanda or, Somalia or something, they're like, oh, that's terrible, but whatever, what am I going to do? If you show them a picture of one little kid, I call this the Indugu effect, because there was that Jack Nicholson film about Schmidt where, he's a retired salesman. He gets his watch, he goes off and he's going to drive around the country and just enjoy his life. And he's watching television one night, just channel surfing. And here's a little commercial for, one of these aid groups that wants you to make a donation. And they show him little Indugu, who's this little black boy in whatever country it was, and he doesn't have any money, and he doesn't have vaccines, and so on and so on. And Jack Nicholson's character gets all weepy eyed. Okay, I'm gonna adopt this kid, right? So he makes a donation, and then he starts getting letters from little Indugu. This is what my life is like. And he starts writing back, talking about his daughter and his motorhome. And he kind of realizes, this poor kid, what does he know about motorhomes breaking down in Utah or whatever? And at the end, he sort of realizes that, this is what's important. And it's a very sweet movie. I mean, he's all teary eyed at the end. And so, but if you would have shown him a picture of 1,000 Indugus with no names, it'd be like, meh, whatever. What am I going to do? So there are techniques of sort of hijacking the mind's natural inclination to care about other people, which is there in our nature, but not for strangers, for our fellow kin and kind, but to make somebody who lives on the other side of the planet seem like an honorary friend. Well, now I know his name. There's a picture. There's him and with his little soccer ball and his friends, and so on. And okay, yeah.
No, well, I got to say it got me. Like I adopted, but the funny thing, I constantly get this stuff about this child because I know they think they have to keep doing that. But I often think to myself, you know what? To be honest, I just want to help. Like you know what I'm saying? But I totally agree that's the hook for sure.
Okay, gentlemen, for the sake of time, I'm going to just take a quick little change in direction here. Free will and moral culpability. Michael, you've talked and written quite a bit about this. If we're going to talk about morality and ethics, we need to talk about free will and moral culpability. We can't label something as moral or immoral if it was all predetermined. And that's what's at the root of some legal cases that are out there. You know, a guy who has to choose between saving this group or that group, knowing that one group is going to die. You know, is he immoral for making that decision? But if one doesn't subscribe to the idea of free will, that we are free to choose our actions, if you're a hard determinist where everything is already predestined to happen, how do we square that with morality?
Well, I'll tell you how I do it. And just briefly, I'm not a hard determinist. I'm not a determinist of any kind. I'm what's called a compatibilist. I think we do live in a determined universe, but that we're part of the causal net of the determined universe. That is, we help cause the future. And so this is based on the idea that while the past is determined, the future has not happened yet, and it is not predetermined. Okay, so hard determinists, they think it is. They think this all was destined in the Big Bang. You know, that you and I would have this conversation on this day at this time. That was determined, 13.8 billion years ago. Well, I think the universe is far more contingent and quirky and accidental than that. But that aside, unless we live in a block universe in which everything that could ever happen has already happened, and that, the deity outside space and time can look and see what happened. Now, I don't think we live in that universe, and the cosmologists I know say we don't. They think that is, the future is not predetermined. So I call this Heraclitus' principle. Heraclitus famously said, you cannot step into the same river twice because the river's not the same and you're not the same.
Yeah.
Every step forward, moment to moment to moment that you go, you have the past in which you can learn from the past. And the last time I did something that resembled this, I did this and it didn't turn out so well, so I'm going to try something different, right? Or future you. The example I give is, there's Shermer now right here at this particular day and time. But tomorrow morning is Tuesday morning, so the guys are going to leave at 7 a.m. on the group bike ride. So I like to meet them. That means I got to get up at 5:30, so I can have my coffee and get around and so on and get ready and then drive down and meet them. Get my bike out and put all the gear together. And so I know I'm not going to want to do this at 5 in the morning. So I'm going to set out tonight, all my clothes, and the coffee's already ready to go. I just push the button. My bike is in the car. My bike shoes and helmet are there. The gloves are ready to put on. In other words, I minimize the amount of things that future Shermer is going to be weak about and not reliable on, because current Shermer is more responsible and reliable. So in that sense, all of life is like a kind of a future against your own self, and you make decisions to control that. So anyway, I think that human volition and choice and agency derives from the fact that we can learn from the past. This is often defined as, could you have done otherwise? This is kind of how determinists say it. Well, if it's a read-only memory tape of what actually happened, then no, I could not have done otherwise, because I would just be replaying the tape of what already happened. But the future is never exactly like the past. You can't rewind the tape. It's a flawed thought experiment. So going forward, you are self-determining your own future, and you are part of the causal net. And for me, that's where agency. And from there, you get moral culpability and so on.
So in the past, I know you've talked about free won't. Is this an example of free won't?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I can opt to change my mind.
Yeah.
And that's an absolutely real thing.
Yeah. Well, you live in a great country for determining, the idea of being able to determine your destiny means kind of the foundation of the American experiment, in a lot of ways.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think it's great. Do you know Sabine Hossenfelder? Do you know?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Hossenfelder.
Do you know her personally?
We've communicated person when I was in Germany, but it didn't work out. But yeah, I like her. I like her.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she posted for me kind of a disturbing video. I think too much about these things, and determinism is one of the things that I often obsess a bit about. But she posted this video about determinism, and that she's convinced. She's a hard determinist. She's convinced.
Oh, she is. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. If you listen to this video,
talk her out of that.
Yeah, please do, because she says, well, the fact is, scientifically, nothing makes any. Why bother? Everything is totally determined. It was determined 13.8 billion years ago. She said, so how do I live then? How do I deal with this? And she comes up coping with the fact that life is, in a sense, meaningless, or at least totally determined, which
But
may
does she
lead.
really believe that? I mean, does she get up? Is she going to get up tomorrow
Well,
morning and
that's
go to
the
work?
thing. Yeah, I know.
Come on.
Yeah,
Is she
I'm
going to
with you.
apply for a grant for future research? Or is
No,
she going to just lay there in bed tomorrow and go, what's the point?
right,
Is she going to look left when she crosses the street?
right,
Yeah,
right,
probably.
right. Yeah, and she's very passionate about her ideas on what science should and shouldn't be and so on. Like, where's the passion come from if you're just a
Right.
total, right?
Right.
And I
Yeah,
think,
right.
and she totally recognizes this, but she can't square it with
Yeah.
what she believes scientifically. And anyway, have a look at that if you're
I will
interested.
watch it as soon as we're done here. Yeah. I like
I'd
her.
lo-
She's a
yeah, I like
character.
her too. I'd love to have her on, but she's maybe too big a fish. But then you're a big fish, and you
You
agreed to
got
come
me
on.
on. Come
Yeah, I
on,
know.
man.
We got.
Luke says.
You know what? When Luke suggested that we get you, I said, "Well, good luck." And he texted me back half hour later and said, "Well, guess what? In half an hour, he responded to me.
You owe me a beer.
Yeah. Well, I'd be glad to have one with you."
Okay, gentlemen, we are long on time. Michael, is there anything that we didn't say, that you didn't get to say, or we didn't talk about this topic, the moral arc and humanity?
Well, I would like to put a plug in again for David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity, which I read after I wrote the moral. In fact, I think it came out after the moral arc, because I think he does open up the possibilities of prosperity, ending human suffering, and accentuating human flourishing into the far future. It makes me feel even more optimistic than I was when I wrote the moral arc. So I do think, whatever you want to call it, just finding explanations for cause and effect. That's what we're pretty good at that, and we can get even better at it. So let's just keep going.
Good. So, Michael, we are out of time. I want to end off with this question here. We talked before we hit the record button about Star Trek, the utopia.
Oh, yes.
People working
Yes.
together. No one's collecting pay, but they're just working together to gain knowledge, equality. There's no gender barriers, no racial barriers, no politics.
Yeah, I don't know about the no money.
Do you think we'll ever get there? We've always got freeloaders who will take advantage of the system.
Of course. Yeah.
Sam Harris, it was just a couple of weeks ago, Sam announced that he could no longer continue his scholarship program for people who say they can't afford his podcast, because he just found way too many people were saying they couldn't afford. So,
Oh wow, I hadn't heard that. Okay,
yeah.
well,
Do you think
it could be. I mean, the amount of corruption. Yeah, it's terrible. It's embarrassing.
So do you think we'll ever reach that Star Trek stage?
No, probably not. No, but I mean, that's the point of art, right? I mean, this is what Gene Roddenberry had in mind in the first place. Let's try something different. A multiracial crew, that was new. And it's just sort of imagination running away. Maybe in 3 centuries we won't need any money, and we'll all have our personal replicator.
Yeah,
in which you can order, Earl Grey tea hot, and you could have your own enterprise, your own starship. I don't know, whatever. But aspirationally, yeah. I mean, this is called post-scarcity economics or Trekonomics. There's a book called Trekonomics about this. Most economists I talk to are not that optimistic. Yes, we can end poverty, but there's never going to have equal, where the Gini index is 0.5. Some are going to be closer to 0. Countries are going to differ. Groups are going to differ. We're never going to have perfect equality like we were talking about. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay, Michael, are there more books in the pipeline? I know you're working on Truth.
The new book Truth comes out. Yeah, it's done. It's copy edited and we're in production now. It comes out in February of 2026.
Great.
So I'm gearing up for a book tour, and we're making a documentary film about it.
Wow.
So that'll be released. Yeah, that'll be released at the same time as the book. So yeah, it'll be
You
fun.
coming to Canada?
Excellent.
Coming to Canada. Well, I don't know if I'll be allowed to, but now if you're the 51st state,
Yeah.
for the 51st state, I could just walk across the border, right?
Sure. Come on in.
Okay. Michael, thanks so much for giving us your time. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, really, very much so.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Enjoy your bike ride.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going out shortly.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, bye for now.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.